And then
Can we quote you on that?
what, no, that's Carrie. Yeah, that's Carrie. Carrie Metlin. But I guess I just think about the issue of scale and, how not only is sort of the decision of managers during fire events as well as kind of the community's acceptance and being involved in fuels reduction and placement of treatments strategically, fuels treatment strategically, so that we have a little bit better tolerance of fire, and then what does a restored mixed severity regime look like, and then what's the appropriate scale. So a big high severity patch of 10,000 acres that maybe reduces the risk for the next fire, is that historical? Is that sort of characteristic of the heterogeneity? And so again, as an ecologist, I think about that all the diversity that fires used to create as sort of the picture that I already indicated, this one here on page 6, if you all have your handouts, this historical photo from kind of a landscape scale perspective of the patchiness that historically was characteristic of these landscapes. And then it's sort of down at further, at kind of a finer scale at stand level, the heterogeneity that fire created, historically, and created some patches of multi-storied complex forests, some patches of open canopy early cereal forests, some sort of this kind of nice open parked out stands. Mixed severity fire regimes historically created all this heterogeneity, and that's what the species that we inherited evolved with. And so that's where the historical range of variability model comes into play, is sort of this heterogeneity that disturbances historically created opportunities that species took advantage of, and that the idea with mixed severity fire regimes is we've moved from this top panel in this handout to this bottom hand. We've reduced the heterogeneity, and we've created what I've heard Paul Hesburgh call is a contagious, more contagious landscape. So where processes like fire or bugs, or disease used to sort of be interrupted by this heterogeneity, now we've created this homogeneous, contagious landscape. And so there's some ecological theory about landscape memory, and so a fire creates memory that then reduces the spread of processes afterwards, and that somebody has suggested that in mixed conifer, mixed severity, the restoration need is that they've lost their memory. The forests have lost their memories, and so we need to restore the heterogeneity through a variety of prescribed fire, through fuels reductions, mechanical treatments, as well as wildland fire use. And so, the issue of scale is really important. What scale would we consider restoration? How do you place treatments, and at what scale? What do we consider sort of the right patchiness? That's one thing that we hear a lot is like, well, we need more heterogeneity. And then, if you look at Google Earth, there's a lot of heterogeneity on the landscape. So it's the type of heterogeneity, and that's, in fact, actually one of the things I wanted you guys to talk about a bit with this Jocko is because everywhere has mixed ownerships, and there was a lot of industrial timberland here historically that has created this checkerboard, and so we need heterogeneity, but we've got this checkerboard. So then what are we looking for in terms of restoring the landscape pattern process? And I think a lot of this is what, as a collaborative, we tried to articulate in kind of big lofty goals about restoring the fire regime, and yet how do you do it has been a real challenge, I think, for the whole collaborative to address. So I guess so. There's the issue of historical range of variability and whether that's even relevant. Did you say who was it that talked about the future desired conditions? Did you bring that up, Scott?
Yeah, and that's my own editorial
on
how you balance that out.
Yeah. So it's the historical range of variability. Is it still relevant? I think that there's some. You can't give up on historical range of variability, but you have to recognize that we're in a different world, and we're in the Anthropocene, and things are way different, and climate change presents greater risk, and so we might have to be thinking about some new models, but we can't, without a historical model, then what does really restoration even mean? So I think that's something that, I've heard, I think we talk about conceptually in a collaborative and in the conservation community, as well as I've heard it from around the country. So, I just wanted to sort of bring in, from my perspective as an ecologist, how I think about all this stuff.
Yeah, I had a question. It seems like with climate change and, there's been kind of a shift into talking a lot about resilience. I was wondering if somebody here could talk about the relationship between managing for restoration and managing for resilience.
Well, I think John could probably talk about it better than I could, that's for sure. But sometimes, there's overlap, and a lot of times there isn't.
Okay.
John, do you want to?
Well, resilience, defined as a condition that you can, that can sort of self-perpetuate and absorb the kinds of disturbances that are occurring in it, and not go on sort of errant pathways or transitions. But how do you define what is those, it comes back again to understanding what was that historical transitions that occurred there, and when do you get out of bounds of those? It brings in the concept of if it's going to be returning, then the concept of ecosystem integrity comes into play, and that is defined as maintaining that the composition, structures, functions of an ecosystem that identify it as an ecosystem. So as such, what's the proper composition, structure, function? That comes back to, again, what was here historically, what is it adapted to and evolved with? So all of those kind of get woven in together. Now the reality, as pointed out, is I think historical range of variability, understanding that is critical to knowing what you want to start with as a template to understand how to maintain the biological diversity and a lot of your other components of the landscape. But what can you do in the future has all these new considerations, so it's a starting place for sure. And so when people talk about resiliency, I think they have to think through that whole process, and it isn't just, well, let's just go out and thin the woods. We hear that a lot, that we'll make it more resilient if we thin it. Well, resilient to what? You have to put it in context to make sense out of it.
And just thinking about in terms of this stand, I mean, this was a restoration treatment, but I mean, here we had really detailed documentation of stem maps, but we couldn't, even though we knew that this area would have been a lot more open and probably not have much to this lodgepole and Doug fir component. It's not right now socially acceptable to like bring it back to some exact condition. So you can use the stem maps and as kind of a starting point about what historical conditions could be, and but it's not trying to actually like recreate those exact conditions, but more perpetuate the processes. Like, so if a wildfire does come through here now, you got to have a resilient stand. So restoration's not, I mean, it's more, again, focusing on creating that resilience and maintaining processes that we think would have been occurring historically, but not trying to get back to some exact condition. But it was really nice to be able to use the stem maps here as a frame of reference and kind of target of what would have occurred. But most of the time you don't have that, but it's nice to have to be able to use places like this that have detailed reference conditions to kind of be thinking about what our landscapes would have looked like 150 years ago or so.
Travis, could I just,
Yes.
one before Tim has to get out of here?
Absolutely.
Is one of the things that I think, to you guys' questions, so much of what we deal with is semantics, and I think also so much of what we deal with is everybody's got their own sort of, single discipline idea of what objectives are. And the fact of the matter is, no matter where we're working on public lands, there's multiple objectives. And I think one thing that, working with Tim and working with our collaborative, that's been really great, and I don't even think often recognize that what we're doing is that most of our projects around here, we recognize that there's multiple objectives. So if you had a chart with the social and with the ecological and with fuels and with economic and all that, I think a lot of what we've done here that's been successful is knowing that we're not going to hit everything in a 10, and most of the time we're hitting like between maybe like 4 and 6, and our decision maker is cool with that. That you're not, if you reduce fuels to, if you hit your fuels target at 100% and your ecologicals at 0, then that's not okay. You know, and in the WUI, I think we're gravitating more toward a higher mark on the fuels and with a little bit of a compromise to ecological, and as we move out, that scale shifts. But I really think that that's one of the things that hamstrings us a lot of times. I mean, I get asked all the time, is this project good for wildlife? Well, you know, I mean, how many different species do you want to say yes and no for, or did we reduce fuels? And we'll talk about that more up at Colt, you know. There's limiting factors on this stuff. So I think that's, you know, and I just wanted to bring that up while Tim's here.
Well, it seems important too. I mean, to take that broader look, and every acre is not going to meet every objective. That's impossible. So what's that mix you want on the landscape to meet all your objectives? Realizing that no one project's going to meet them all.
Yeah, I think that's that's what's been so great about working with the collaborative, is to realize that, you know, trade-offs, you know, so you do more fuels, maybe less ecology in closer to communities, but that actually can benefit, that create, you know, maybe use resilience. It drives me crazy to use resilience because people throw that around and everybody shakes their head, we know what we're talking about, but you have to really decompose it to really understand it. But the fact that, you know, landscape restoration requires, you know, sort of being able to understand or at least appreciate the complexity of short-term, small-scale trade-offs for the benefit of the larger landscape. And so, I mean, to me, that's been the great thing about working with these guys and with the Southwestern Crown CFLRP, is to, first of all, appreciate the complexity that you all have to deal with, that you know, because we all have our stovepipes and our disciplines, and we think about certain things, and it's easy to be judgmental, and you realize kind of how complex, from social and political and economic, as well as ecological, that these you know, issues are, and that you really do have to put everything in a landscape scale perspective. And I think sometimes that's overused too. Is like, oh, well, you have to think about the landscape. Well, what do you really mean by that? Let's be a little bit more rigorous the way we talk about that. But in terms of, you know, understanding those trade-offs and how, you know, local scale trade-offs or short-term trade-offs could potentially lead to a you know, larger scale, longer term benefits. I mean, that's where, when we talk about adaptive management, it becomes really tricky. So then you say, well, we've monitored this and we've seen these trade-offs. Well, we're not going to adjust management necessarily for that particular place because we still have to put it in this larger landscape. So then what data do we need to really be able to sort of demonstrate that? And in some ways, I see the collaboratives all across the country as, you know, nobody's doing anything perfectly, but over time, I hope the 23 or whatever the CFLRP collaboratives sort of start to shed some light on that complexity and those local trade-offs and landscape benefits.
Can I just throw out that,
Yeah.
you know, today we are just on one district of the Southwest Crown Collaborative. So it's a collaborative that encompasses 3 national forests, 3 districts, and each landscape is different. So just adding to our confusion and complexity.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about the scale issue. I work a lot with the Front Range Collaborative, and that's on 2 national forests. And Colorado has some issues with prescribed fire, and in that mixed severity regime, part of our problem is talking about desired conditions for openings and how much should be open and how large those openings should be. And without the ability to use fire, we have to create those openings with mechanical treatments, which we get a lot of pushback as well. And so I'm wondering how you guys how you deal with it in terms of, have you guys figured out the distribution of openings and how you're going to go about doing them, and then how do you deal with that in the NEPA? Because our NEPA is limited to us in terms of how big our openings can be.
Well, the only thing that I'm even remotely qualified to discuss on that issue, these guys would be better to answer questions, is just to bring you to page 9 of the handout that I passed around this morning. And so when we talk about historical references, I was going to do this at lunch, but when we talk about historical references or desired future conditions and stuff, we actually have what we think is a pretty cool contemporary reference in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And so just over the Swan Range down in the South Fork of the Flathead, it's a little bit higher in elevation than some of these areas, but in terms of species composition and size, you can get into the Bob and it looks just like this. And there's the wildfire of 2003 that was burning over there. We've compared to the prescribed fire here. And so basically these 2 maps compare the stem maps of the way the fire, sort of the heterogeneity and the tree neighborhood, clumpiness or gappiness from the wildfire compared to this treatment to show that, the fire did have some higher, severity patches that they created, and as a result there's a lot more regeneration of larch back there. And then we had a lot more coastal debris, which is in some ways trivial because the logs that may have fallen down in a wildfire here went to the bearfishing pipe. So, Andrew Larson works up at University of Montana, and he's kind of on the cutting edge of this within stand heterogeneity. And so, I think this at least gives us some reference for what those gaps might be in terms of how to get them. These guys would better answer that question. And I guess I would just say then, I think from there, I think you still need to scale up to some larger landscape, sort of heterogeneity at a bigger scale. And some of John's modeling work is helping with thinking about through that, like what's the landscape composition of structural stages.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's the thing we struggle with as well, because we're honing in on within stand heterogeneity, but then when we start talking about the landscape, we're just waving our arms and.
That like it's a bad thing.
No, I'm not. But some people do think, it's hard to convince people. So.
Yeah, I was
You
going
have
to
to
ask,
talk about
how
both.
much do you guys have to mark all the trees for the various treatments? When you come into these areas, it's a full tree mark.
Sometimes you have leaf tree mark or cut tree mark, and we are starting to.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so this is a old growth western larch stand that had been over about 150 years since the last fire, and fire was really a part of this stand. But we think burned approximately every 24 years, between like 9 to 40. The longest documented period between fires had been 40 years before European settlement. And so in the late 90s, realized that there are a lot of big old trees. Most of these trees in the stand are over 500 years old. And really, but at that time, there was a lot of ingrowth and really thinking about it, that the stand was changing conditions. There weren't any young western larch. The youngest one, I think, was still 100 years old. So we are losing larch from the stand. And it's a key difference when restoring old growth stands that are fire dependent versus stands, old growth of kind of like the Pacific Northwest, where you think about things progressing into a climax community. These forests here, we call them fire climax, and that without fire, you're going to lose this old growth component. And so the forest in 1999 and 2000 thinned this area, removed a lot of the Douglas fir and a lot of lodgepole that had come in. And that early mechanical thinning is necessary in a lot of these stands, because just treating by prescribed fire after it's been so long since fire, our Douglas fir are more fire tolerant. A prescribed fire is not going to kill those trees. So the forest thinned the stand, removing those trees that were younger than 150 years old, and really trying to thin it out and trying to save our old western larch and make them healthy, and also encourage new western larch regeneration. And so then in 2003, this area was prescribed burned in the fall, and that was to, again, really to foster that western larch regeneration, because you need bare mineral soil. So just thinning wouldn't work in this case, most likely, but that thinning combination prescribed burning was we felt had the desired objectives. One of the big concerns in this stand was looking at the litter and duff layer, and how much duff right at the base of this tree had collected in that 150 years since fire. So there was a study here to where we raked the duff from a lot of these trees to to see if that was necessary, and if it was necessary to try to reduce mortality in a lot of these big larch. So those trees were raked, and then you could, so we just removed all this litter and duff. It's still pretty thin, but it was 8 to 10 inches deep before the burn. And you can see, like, this one wasn't raked before the burn, and that's what made this big cupping out where that bark burned away at the base. And so western larch is probably the most fire-tolerant species in western forests, and so they just have incredibly thick bark. And what we found from that is that raking is really important if a tree has an open, exposed fire scar, to prevent fire from getting into the inside of the tree and burning it out. But if a tree doesn't have a fire scar, the raking wasn't necessary. We didn't lose any trees that we didn't rake that didn't have a fire scar. So that was an important lessons learned from this treatment, that the combination of thinning, a low intensity, low severity burn, set up a bare mineral soil to encourage some western larch, and also raking around trees that had fire scars will keep this old tree component, so that we can have 500 plus year old trees on the landscape.
Maybe in 30 seconds, can you sum up what all that means to fire managers, to people who are managing land in these types of areas?
Okay.
What advice you would give to them?
So I think in old growth stands where you've got really trees that have really high value, it's good. Restoration can be a slower process. You might have to have multiple entries to. It's where you've had such a long period of time without fire. You have to really think about coming into that stand. It might take 2 or 3 times to get back a condition where you feel like you have a healthy forest.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Really close to the town, and it's old growth. There's not a lot of old growth left, so you're under even more pressure to not lose these trees that aren't easily replaced. So one of the things that was a concern is because even after the thinning and reducing some of that potential the fire behavior and potential crown fire, thinking about the ground fuels, which is it's easy to overlook. You often kind of think about forest structure and that kind of active fire behavior, but really there was a lot of concern, especially in the kind of early 2000s, with different studies starting up about long-term smoldering in some of these areas where it has been so long since burning, and there's lots of duff starting to accumulate, and are we going to get a lot of delayed mortality, and not like come in the day after the burn and everything looks great, but worried that maybe a year later some of these trees start declining and eventually dying because of either root kill or cambium kill. So Mick Harrington started a study in here where not the biggest trees, but not the champion tree, but 45 of the old larch. We raked around half of them to remove that duff, that deep duff. So I don't know if we're gonna walk around the stand some, but larch makes a really deep duff mound, kind of right at the base of the tree, kind of even more so than ponderosa pine. It's really deep, and then it kind of tapers out really quick, kind of this big hill around the tree, and worried that you can have really high heating in there for up to 48 hours. So even though the bark is incredibly thick on larch, that if that long-term heating is enough to kill the tree. So Mick started a study here, and I had a very similar study in Northern California in ponderosa and Jeffrey pine. And there was a study by Carolyn Sieg and Jim Fowler in Northern Arizona and ponderosa pine, all looking at raking treatments. And is it a viable treatment option in areas like this where we have maybe need to do some more intensive treatments to think about restoring these stands. And so so we measured the duff consumption really in a lot of very intensive sampling right at the base of the trees, and it was an average of 8 inches deep at the base of the tree of just really compacted needles, with larch having makes a very compact duff mound at the base, and basically found Mick and we tracked the trees for 7 years, at least there in the publication, but it's even longer now, and there was no mortality regardless of whether it was raked or not. So, it was a good finding for larch, in that, you know, even with this really deep duff, there doesn't seem to be, it could cause some basal injury, but it didn't cause enough to ever cause any mortality. Yeah, you can see, so where it kind of makes a cup, or if y'all want to look at that burn tree, I can't remember if that was a sample tree, but the bark, so when we raked around the tree, kind of, you know, bark's always sloughing off above, and it's falling, but when we remove that duff layer, you kind of find all this rotten bark where it couldn't, it couldn't flake off because the duff was keeping up against there. So the bark was, it's really thick at the base, but it was also a lot looser, and it would burn a little, but it's still, like, even with that, and you can see like several inches burned, or but there's still a couple of inches, and bark is a really good insulator from heat, so it was never enough to. And a couple of the trees had about 35% basal kill, but the trees seemed to be doing just fine for that, and that's what caused the fire scars. Circumference, yeah, but 80% of the trees had hardly any cambium kill detected. Yes, so it had 100% consumption, or I think it was 99% consumption on the trees that weren't raked. With a fall burn, but even though you can have high, or, you know, pretty high moistures in the duff, but once smoldering sets in, it's going to probably burn all the way. And so this was burned in September, I think. Do you remember? Yeah, September 2003. So it was the duff moist. Let's see, down. So litter was 13% fuel moisture. The duff was 27. The upper duff was 27%, and the lower duff was 35%. And so that's plenty dry enough for you would expect duff to be consumed, and it was.
Well, I'm relatively new to larch.
Yeah.
Those are amazing findings.
Yeah.
I'm used to the level of concern around ponderosa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the ponderosa in northern Arizona and in northern California, we didn't find significant mortality in the unraked trees either, and it seems to be happening. So I don't know if we just didn't pick the right stand. We had 100% consumption. There was at least 6 inches of duff, not quite as deep as here. Ponderosa kind of makes a more spread out duff mound compared to larch, but it didn't seem to affect mortality even for those studies. But I've heard reports, and I think there's still that concern. What we did find, and I cored the trees like 5 years after raking, just in the unburned section, because they had a paired unburned rake, and because there's been concern that maybe raking would stress the trees and impact, or kind of just weaken them, maybe set them up for some bark beetle attacks. And we found that the raking didn't negatively affect growth. So, which I think it's a good point that so here we didn't find that raking mattered or had a difference. But in an area where maybe you only have a handful of old growth stands on your forest, and you really want to be safe, play it safe, you can rake and it won't hurt the trees, certainly. So, and it could be ponderosa and like Jeffrey pine. I mean, those have mountain pine beetle, western pine beetle, the Jeffrey beetle. They have these aggressive bark beetles, whereas larch doesn't have a bark beetle. So they are larch are more fire tolerant for sure than ponderosa. And because they don't have beetles coming in after the fire, potentially then they can, it's one less concern with the larch.
I'm pretty sure I've read a paper by you on this whole topic. And it is, and what I'm getting right now is that let's not worry so much about those duck mounds. But I'm hearing others who interpret your paper to say we need to chase down those duck mounds and do raking.
Yeah, so I think it's a valid treatment option, and it gives you flexibility if you're worried. It's a very expensive. It's certainly never going to be a treatment that you're going to apply across a forest or a big 1,000-acre project. But in an area like this, where how many acres was this? 20 acres for burning, and you're right next to the town. You've got the champion larch was here. I think it's awesome that the district would burn in these forests and recognize that fire-dependent old growth, you have to have fire. So and to take that risk. One of the big concerns, and where raking is it's necessary, is if you have fire scars. So even though we didn't find mortality, no mortality in this stand, all the sample trees that had exposed fire scars were raked. And if we hadn't done it that way, then you would have gotten mortality, because that fire scar is just super vulnerable to fire, start burning, and larch has a lot of hot rot, and it just burns out the center. And that happened, I don't know if there's a couple that came down that weren't sample trees that we lost. And that would have happened historically. It's just you're under more pressure to maintain those big trees now because there's so few of them on the landscape. So I think that's where raking comes in. Like if you've got some high value trees that have exposed fire scars, you really need to rake. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask Tim a question about the burn. So September of '03.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big fire year. There was a fire burn in the Bob. There was the one up the North Fork of the Flathead.
Yeah,
it was
a big season.
Yeah. So
this is when the season cooled off.
Okay. So
yeah,
it was post that.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. We have to have the moisture and the conditions to do it, and we pay real close attention to what's coming behind it too.
Mm-hmm.
So
Travis,
yeah.
Sorry, Tim. No question though that socially, it's something that goes back to fall burning, and a huge struggle for us is when you have big fire seasons, and then we have some rain, and then we have a window in the fall, and people have been breathing smoke in the valley for 2.5 months, and it's like, oh, now the agency's lighting more fire.
Yeah.
So the fall burning has, it really has some social complexities beyond the question that got asked to Chad just about smoke management. It's kind of helping tolerance to the smoke.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to bring it up because I just know that looking at the distribution from '84 till 2009, 2003 is one of those big years.
Yeah.
And thinking like, wow.
It was. Yeah, 2000 was a big year. Incidentally, the district since 1980 has experienced, 38% of the district has experienced fire. Either non-lethal, low severity to lethal, stand replacing. Big fires, a lot of that to the west of us in the backcountry where we have fire use events that have been going on. So district's 400,000 acres, a lot of fire in the landscape. 2000 really got people's attention.
23%?
38%.
38% in how long a period?
Since 1980. Yeah, I have I'll leave this with Scott and he can show you some of my notes for this next time.
Doing them, and then how do you deal with that in the NEPA? Because our NEPA is limited to us in terms of how big our openings can be.
Yeah. Well, the only thing that I'm even remotely qualified to discuss on that issue, these guys would be better to answer the question, is just to bring you to page 9 of the handout that I passed around this morning. And so when we talk about historical references, I was going to do this at lunch, but when we talk about historical references or future, desired future conditions and stuff, we actually have what we think is a pretty cool contemporary reference in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And so just over the Swan Range down in the South Fork of the Flathead, it's a little bit higher in elevation than some of these areas, but in terms of species composition and size, you can get into the Bob and it looks just like this. And there's the wildfire of 2003 that was burning over there. We've compared to the prescribed fire here. And so basically these two maps compare the stem maps of the way the fire, sort of the heterogeneity and the tree neighborhood, clumpiness or gappiness from the wildfire compared to this treatment to show that, the fire did have some higher, severity patches that they created, and as a result there's a lot more regeneration of larch back there, and then we had a lot more close woody debris, which is in some ways trivial because the logs that may have fallen down in the wildfire here went to the purification pipe. So, Andrew Larson works up at University of Montana, and he's kind of on the cutting edge of this within stand heterogeneity, and so I think this at least gives us some reference for what those gaps might be in terms of how to get them. These guys would be better to answer that question. And I guess I would just say then I think from there I think you still need to scale up to some larger landscape sort of heterogeneity at a bigger scale, and some of John's modeling work is helping with thinking about through that, like what's the landscape composition at structural stages.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's the thing we struggle with as well, because we're honing in on within stand heterogeneity, but then when we start talking about the landscape, we're just waving our arms and.
Say that like it's a bad thing.
No, I'm not. What some people do think, it's hard to convince people. So.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how much do you guys have to mark all the trees for these various treatments? When you come into these areas, it's a full tree mark.
Sometimes you have leaf tree mark or country mark, and we are starting to